Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. Today, we're going to continue the deeper dive into Europe that we've been taking in the last few episodes. Today, specifically, we will cover education, labour, infrastructure, energy, health, and shelter and housing within the EU. So let's get straight into it. We're going to start by discussing education in the EU. Now, education systems can vary between the EU and other countries around the world, but there are also some notable differences between countries within the EU. I'll firstly explore the EU versus non-EU countries. So when it comes to governance and education standards, EU countries participate in the European education area and follow the Bologna process. This ensures that comparable degrees, student mobility, and credit can transfer between member states in the European Union. Many countries also align policies through Eurodis and other EU benchmarks. Outside of the EU, we see some countries possess more centralised governance structures for education, such as Turkey, whereas others around the world are more decentralised. Naturally, outside of the EU, there are also fewer cross-border education initiatives. So when it comes to funding and equity in education, public spending in the EU is between 4 and 5%. Some countries such as Finland, Sweden and Germany offer tuition-free or low-cost university education. Collective EU funding can aid poorer members of the EU to invest in education infrastructure, such as Romania and Bulgaria. Outside of the EU, we can see spending strategies vary quite wildly, and education inequality is often seen. Moving on to access to education now, and within the EU, there is a high level of secondary and degree level education. This is part of a wider push around education inclusion and reducing early school leavers. Outside of the EU, there are once again greater disparities in enrolment in education. Especially in rural areas, children can often help support family businesses, such as in the agriculture industry. And so reducing early leavers in such environments will be a function of improving education infrastructure, the quality of education, and the rise of the services economy. Within Europe, schemes such as Erasmus can help boost education participation in some countries, especially in Spain and Germany, who receive the most students as a result of the Erasmus scheme. Also in the EU, some countries use dual systems that blend vocational training with apprenticeships that enable students to learn practical skills. There has been a recent push to modernise vocational education and training systems across the EU. After all, we do need workers in key industries such as energy and construction. One key example of this is the nuclear industry, where the build-out during the 20th century has seen many of these experts retire without passing much knowledge on to other generations. The latest efforts are seeking to address this issue across a wide range of industries, not just within the nuclear industry, and this is necessary. Some nations outside of the EU remain heavily focused on an academic education, and in such vocational industries that are vital for the future, they risk lagging in knowledge transfer, as the EU is attempting to correct currently. Finally, when it comes to digitalisation of education, the EU has the Digital Education Action Plan, which promotes electronic learning, digital skills, and artificial intelligence as tools to facilitate learning. There is also a strong emphasis on maintaining learning after the formal education ends through workplace courses and general skills expansion. When we explore outside of the EU, digitalisation in education can vary dramatically. Firstly, the countries have to have access to the technology to digitalise education, which some countries around the world do not have this access. Also, aspects of education such as connectivity and teacher training are lacking in some nations, and as a result, digitalisation suffers. If we specifically now explore the differences between countries within the European Union, we typically see high investment per student in Northern and Western Europe, as these countries usually possess a strong public education system. There is also a wide range of vocational pathways available in Northern and Western Europe. As we move into Southern Europe, public education is still free, but is often funded less. As we move out to Eastern Europe, the legacy of Soviet-era education systems still remains. Reform is ongoing, but strong basic education is available in many of these countries. It's when we once again look at more rural environments that access to education becomes lessened. There are also teacher shortages, and some curriculum can be seen as outdated. Eastern Europe also generally suffers more from brain drain, as skilled learners will leave the country, hoping to find better education and better job prospects for the future. Within Europe, this would typically take them to the north or the west. The largest net loss migration states within the EU in 2024 were Poland, Greece, Czechia, Romania, and Slovakia. So it's clear that some countries within Europe experience a disconnect between education and labour. Moving on from education now, let's assess how this presents itself in European labour markets. Now, labour in the EU is well known for its freedom of movement, as ensured by the European Labour Authority. This helps to enable cross-border jobs, but as discussed in the education discussion, this can contribute to brain drain from Eastern Europe, and it can also lead to labour gaps in Western Europe, especially in cheaper labour jobs. An ageing workforce in Europe also contributes to these labour gaps further. When it comes to workers' rights, Europe, on average, is the least repressive region for workers in the entire world, but it has been experiencing a steady deterioration of rights over the last 4 years. The rise of far-right parties in many European nations in the last few years also threatens migration of workers and their rights within the EU. As for other differences between the European Union and non-European Union states, those outside of the EU are typically more constrained by visa regimes in comparison to Europe, and states who aren't a part of the European Union but have nations close by often send a high number of temporary workers to the European Union. As I discussed earlier, EU workers in general have strong protections such as minimum wage, parental leave, anti-discrimination laws, and safe working conditions, especially when compared to the rest of the world. This is because all EU countries follow the European Pillar of Social Rights principle. However, as the Global Rights Index presents, the protection from nation to nation within Europe can differ. For example, Germany has a rating of 1, which refers to a sporadic violation of workers' rights. However, Hungary has a rating of 4, which indicates systematic violations of workers' rights. Also, despite these individual data points and the fact that some countries are better than others, the trend here is that countries are getting worse, not better, when it comes to workers' rights. Outside of the EU, labour protections and worker rights vary just as much as they do within the EU. When it comes to unions, this also differs from nation to nation within the EU. Some, such as Sweden and Belgium, maintain a high density of unions, while others, such as Hungary, are seeing a decline. When it comes to wages, they are significantly higher in Western and Northern European Union countries, but the EU coordinates a minimum wage directive in an attempt to push fair pay for all. Despite this, wage gaps do remain between the northwest and the southeast of Europe. Most nations surrounding the EU typically have lower wage levels in comparison to the European Union, but some nations, such as the UK and Switzerland, do buck this trend. Due to informal labour and weaker labour laws, wage inequality can also be extreme in some countries outside of the EU. Finally, gender pay gaps do exist within Europe, but labour participation is generally quite high. There is an increasing focus on youth unemployment, elderly participation, and the inclusion of skilled migrants, but some countries struggle more with these aspects of labour than others. For example, in Spain, youth unemployment was over 25% in the May 2025 data. Outside of the EU, we can see youth unemployment rise even further, with Bosnia and Herzegovina and North Macedonia both exceeding 25%. Outside of the EU, some regions experience incredibly low female participation in labour markets, especially in the Middle East and North Africa. One of the biggest differences to note between EU member states here is migration. Nations in Western and Northern Europe typically have more ageing populations, and as a result, skilled migration is one way that these countries can maintain the level of their labour workforce. But as we've seen in the last few years, some nations are worried about cultural clashes, and so the tightening of border controls has occurred. This is especially notable in Germany, who was one of the first countries to begin down this road. But when it comes to demographic issues such as an Asian population, migration of skilled labour is one of the best strategies that can push the can further down the road without major societal change to how labour and the world of work functions around the world. Now, as I've alluded to, sometimes in order for labour changes to occur, the infrastructure required also needs to be in place. This brings us on to the next discussion, which is based on infrastructure within the European Union. Within the EU, all member states have access to European Union structural and cohesion funds, which, especially for poorer member states of the European Union, can provide a massive boost to infrastructure funding. The European Investment Bank also finances sustainable infrastructure projects in the region. And there are also multinational coordinated infrastructure projects, such as the 10T network and the Green Deal. The aim of the 10T network is to create 9 European transport corridors across the continent. However, in general, since the financial crisis, investment in infrastructure across the European Union has been falling. Now, to return to transport networks, the high-speed rail and modern highway systems in Europe connect Western and Northern Europe through major EU cities and logistic hubs very well. As you move further south and east, developed urban transport infrastructure remains, but rural areas are lagging behind. Rapid improvements have been seen over the last few decades in Poland especially, but in surrounding areas, infrastructure is less integrated and is sometimes poorly maintained. This is especially true as you move outside of the EU into areas such as the Balkans. European funds are helping to improve the region just outside of the EU, but they remain lagging. So when it comes to transport infrastructure, it is a case-by-case situation when it comes to countries on the periphery and further outside of the EU. Also, when it comes to digital infrastructure, 5G, fibre broadband, and smart cities are being pushed through the EU's Digital Decade 2030 agenda. This is especially contributing to large improvements in rural broadband and digital inclusion pursuits. But when we look outside of the EU, others, again, such as the Balkans, do lag behind. Next, when it comes to energy infrastructure, Western Europe has attempted to be a leader in the pursuit of green energy. One bad pursuit of this has been seen in Germany's energy industry, which has been left damaged as a result of their over-pursuit in weather-dependent renewables. Countries have to ensure that they possess diversified, adaptable energy industries that don't rely solely on these weather-dependent renewable sources. However, when explored collectively, the European Union is in a good position because they have many strategies that can ensure strong integration between states, such as interconnectors. Some cross-border pipelines also exist, and this ensures that fossil fuels can have more transport options throughout the European Union. Despite the mistakes of the past, we do seem to be at a point where nations are recognising their mistakes, and the pursuit of baseload power supply is being undertaken within Europe, especially in the nuclear industry. Now, in discussing energy infrastructure, this now brings us on to a wider discussion on the energy industry within the European Union. Firstly, when it comes to energy prices, we see quite high prices in Western and Northern Europe, which is contributed to due to the flawed ESG and green movements. This is because energy production from these sources heavily fluctuates, and this can lead to large fluctuations in supply. In Southern Europe, they have excellent solar potential, and so investment here would be best utilising the environment in which they live. This is what all countries within the EU should be attempting to do, but despite this, prices in Southern Europe also remain high. If energy storage could be improved, this could ensure that solar could provide electricity even at night, if the storage is sufficient enough. Of course, this would again depend on supply and demand fluctuations day to day. Due to economic concerns, there is some resistance to weather-dependent renewables that is emerging, and in my opinion, this concern is rightly founded. Natural gas and crude oil remain a huge part of how our daily lives function, with fossil fuels providing over 80% of energy consumption last year. And so natural gas and crude oil will remain a part of our daily lives for decades to come. Rejecting them too quickly will lead to reduced energy supply, and as a result, prices will rise. When it comes to Eastern Europe, they are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, such as coal and Russian gas. Although, through the Ukraine war, this has taken a dramatic shift in the last few years. In fact, at the start of January, Ukraine didn't renew the EU gas transit agreement with Russia, and so some nations will suffer if gas flows are reduced, especially Slovakia, Moldova, and Austria. The Eastern European transition to more diversified, adaptable energy sectors has also been hampered by older grids, energy poverty, and affordability issues. Next, when it comes to energy security, Europe has been deeply affected by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. Both of these examples make it clear that energy security is becoming a major issue within Europe. Europe believed that the answer to control its own energy security and to reduce dependency was weather-dependent renewables, but weather-dependent renewables can actually reduce energy security if they are not supported by baseload sources. When it comes to nations outside of the EU, some nations without domestic production are heavily dependent on natural gas and crude oil giants, such as the United States and members of OPEC Plus. Being dependent on a single supplier or even a small group of suppliers can make such countries vulnerable to pain. Since energy is life, all efforts should be made to protect supply. But if countries are dependent upon other countries, then the countries who provide them this energy will protect themselves first. This makes these countries susceptible to pain. Again, energy is also dependent on infrastructure, and clear bottlenecks can form outside of the EU where infrastructure is lacking. When it comes to electricity access, within the EU, there is universal electricity access through reliable electricity grids. EU directives promote grid stability and consumer rights as vital pursuits in the European Union energy sector. It's when we look outside of the EU that electricity access can be patchy in underdeveloped regions of the world. We saw 91% of the global population have access to electricity in 2021, but the rural-urban gap is significant in this context. Rural areas contributed to 80% of the world's population without electricity access, and a large proportion of these rural areas without access were found in sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, when it comes to innovation in the European Union's energy industry, funding through multiple schemes, such as Horizon Europe and the Just Transition Fund, ensure that all EU member states benefit in the pursuit of energy innovation. Outside of the EU, there are other schemes that exist, such as World Bank funding and China's Belt and Road Initiative, but this can often come in the form of loans, or it can leave a country dependent on external support. Without energy, the world would stop functioning. And another aspect of life on an individual level that is necessary in our everyday lives is healthcare. When it comes to access to healthcare, most EU nations almost guarantee universal healthcare access, whether through national health services, such as in Italy, or via mandatory insurance models, as we see in Germany and the Netherlands. Outside of the EU, some nations possess similar structures to the European Union, such as national health services or insurance models, but some countries employ out-of-pocket healthcare strategies. Healthcare in Europe is also of a high quality and is regulated by EU cross-border patient rights, medical safety standards, and the European Medicines Agency. In some regions outside of Europe that are less developed, due to outdated equipment, staff shortages, or corruption, quality can decrease. This is especially true in regions of war, where underinvestment can also significantly lower quality even further. The EU typically also has high life expectancy, low infant mortality, and great preventative care in comparison to other regions around the world. When it comes to funding, this largely comes from public taxes or social insurance. In the European Union, there exists a range of funding models, but spending on healthcare typically ranges from 6 to 12% of gross domestic product. Finally, the European Union is making strong progress in electronic health systems and telemedicine via the EU for Health programme, which continues to promote cross-border innovation. Finally, one area of the European Union where there clearly exists some problems is when it comes to exploring shelter and housing. When it comes to affordability in housing, in major cities in the EU, there is rising pressure on affordability. In many countries, rent burdens have risen over 40% of income. Some countries do use rent controls or subsidies, but affordability whether ownership or renting is a clear problem. This problem also persists in the developed world outside of the EU. Outside of these regions, housing can be cheaper in less developed parts of the world, but quality can be lower and less regulated. When it comes to ownership, most EU countries in the East have high ownership rates, such as Romania with 95.6% and Slovakia with 93.6% due to post-communist privatisation. In Northern and Western Europe, we see more renters. Outside of Europe, the Middle East sees high ownership, while the UK, US, and South Korea see low housing ownership and high mortgage dependency. When it comes to quality of housing, in the EU, housing standards, regulations, water, sanitation, and construction regulations are maintained to a high standard. This is also true for other OECD nations. However, in post-conflict or low-income regions, we can see quality decline. We also see regions susceptible to natural disasters, such as Turkey. In these regions, quality can also decline due to damage from such events. Finally, due to the rising affordability crisis, homelessness is on the rise in Western Europe. Social housing pursuits are attempting to address these issues from nation to nation, but some countries lag behind significantly. The Netherlands is a leader in social housing pursuits, with 30% of total housing being social housing. The EU does set wider policies targeting integrated homelessness solutions, and programmes such as RESC EU create emergency shelter reserves for thousands of people. When we look outside of the EU, some nations have no homelessness strategy at all, and for those that do, many rely on non-government organisations or religious institutions. So, I'm aware that this has been quite a information-heavy episode, but all the characteristics that we've explored today are important. When we collect them together, it clearly presents a north-south and west-east divide within the EU. If you head over to the blog on Substack that supports this episode, you will find links and sources to many of the points that I've made today. That's at Geopolitics Explained over on Substack. But when we look forward, unity and cohesion within the European Union will depend on managing these levels of internal inequality. If this isn't pursued, the European Union will remain fractured. As we move forward, we still have many other aspects of Europe to discuss, such as security, demographics, and politics. I will discuss these over the coming weeks. I will also zoom out and discuss how these aspects of European policy could contribute to technological change, and consequently, how this could lead to lasting societal change within the European Union. I will also assess if this will see the European Union rise to become a geopolitical superpower in its own right, or if it is doomed to fail. That's all for today. I've been Dylan. I'll talk to you next time.